The road leading to Pineheart Camp felt endless, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt swallowed by the towering pines on either side. The car's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles pale in the dim light. The silence inside the car was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of the trees as the wind pushed through them. But it wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of it, the kind of quiet that felt alive, pressing against the windows, as if the forest itself was watching us. We shouldn't have come back. The thought repeated in my mind, louder with each passing mile. None of us had said it out loud, but the unease was palpable. I could feel it in the way Maddie kept fidgeting in the passenger seat, her nails tapping against the screen of her phone, even though there was no signal. In the way Ethan sat stiffly in the back, his arms crossed over his chest as he stared out at the dark trees. And in the way Logan hadn't said a word since we passed the old sign for Ashford, the one that had been weathered and bent by decades of neglect. The camp came into view suddenly, the trees parting to reveal a wide clearing. The buildings stood like ghosts of the past, their roofs sagging and their windows shattered. The air grew colder as I pulled the car to a stop, the engine sputtering into silence. No one moved. We just sat there, staring at the place that had haunted our childhood memories, and, more recently, our nightmares. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint smell of damp wood and decay. The trees whispered softly, their branches scraping against one another like skeletal fingers. I shivered, gripping the pendant around my neck, a small silver charm that had belonged to Sarah. I hadn't taken it off since the day she disappeared. Let's just get this over with, I muttered under my breath, more to myself than anyone else. My voice sounded foreign in the oppressive quiet. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots unnaturally loud. The others followed reluctantly, their faces pale and tense. The fog clung to us as we approached the camp, the shadows shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. The main lodge loomed ahead, its front doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The once vibrant sign above the entrance was now faded and unreadable, the letters cracked and peeling. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked under our weight, each step echoing in the cavernous space. The room was exactly as I remembered it, but wrong, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The long dining tables were still there, but they were warped and covered in a thin layer of dust. The fireplace was cold and empty, its stones blackened by years of neglect, and on the far wall, the old corkboard still hung, its yellowed flyers curling at the edges. But it wasn't just the decay that set my nerves on edge. It was the feeling, that same oppressive weight I'd felt in the car, now amplified tenfold. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe, and my ears rang with a faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Maddie found the journal first. It was lying on one of the tables, its cover cracked and faded, but otherwise untouched. She picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing away the layer of dust. Something about the way she froze made my stomach drop. The pages were filled with handwriting, jagged, hurried lines that seemed to have been scrawled in desperation. Symbols I didn't recognize were scattered throughout, their sharp angles and looping curves almost hypnotic. One passage caught my eye. The ink smudged, but still legible. The tree demands a sacrifice. It always has. It always will. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned away, unable to look at the words any longer. That's when I noticed Logan. He was standing near the fireplace, staring at something just out of sight. His expression was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. I called his name, but he didn't respond. The hum grew louder. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something in the shadows near the hearth. Something that shouldn't have been there. A shape, faint and indistinct, but undeniably human. It moved slowly, its form flickering like a faulty projector. And I froze. It turned its head toward us, and for a split second, I thought I saw Sarah's face. The pendant around my neck burned cold against my skin, and the air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping suddenly. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Woo-woo. My breath caught in my throat as it reached out, its hand thin and elongated, its fingers curling toward Logan. A scream tore through the silence. Not Logan's, but Maddie's. The sound jolted me into motion, and I grabbed Logan's arm, pulling him away from the fireplace. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the faint echo of Maddie's scream and the oppressive hum that now filled the room. We stumbled outside, the cold air hitting us like a slap. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, my mind racing with questions I couldn't begin to answer. The others were just as shaken, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The hum followed us. It wasn't just in the lodge anymore. It was in the air, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet, seeping into our bones. The trees around the clearing seemed to close in, their branches twisting and bending as though they were alive. I clutched the pendant tightly, its surface cool and smooth against my palm, and prayed silently that it would protect us. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, its form distorted and wrong. It didn't step into the light. It didn't need to. The presence alone was enough to send my heart into overdrive. We shouldn't have come back. The night pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. The hum we'd heard inside the lodge followed us out into the clearing, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to seep into my chest and settle there. I could feel it in my bones, a pulse that matched my racing heartbeat. The others stood frozen, their breaths visible in the cold air, their eyes darting toward the shifting shadows at the tree line. I tried to focus, but the weight of the pendant in my hand was impossible to ignore. Its surface was cold, too cold, the engraved symbols biting into my palm. The faint green glow from earlier had returned, casting eerie shapes onto the ground beneath me. My stomach twisted as the light pulsed in time with the hum, as though the pendant and the sound were connected, feeding off each other. The first scream came from Ethan. I turned just in time to see him stumble backward, his face pale, his wide eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. He pointed toward the lodge, his hand shaking violently. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Nothing except the dark, yawning doorway and the faint flicker of movement just beyond it. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice trembling, but Ethan didn't answer. He just shook his head, his lips moving soundlessly as he backed away from the building. His terror was contagious, spreading through us like wildfire, and I felt my own resolve begin to crumble. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the clearing, carrying with it the sharp scent of earth and decay. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches scraping against one another like nails on a chalkboard. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. Maddie clutched her arms tightly around herself, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "I don't want to be here anymore," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rising noise. She turned to me, her wide, tear-filled eyes pleading for reassurance. I couldn't give. "Claire, let's go, please." But it wasn't that simple. Wah. It never had been. The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, slowly at first, then faster, shifting and coalescing into shapes that defied explanation. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but my mind refused to process it. The shapes were humanoid, but wrong, twisted and elongated, their edges flickering like static on an old television. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, their heads tilting at odd angles, as though studying us. The pendant in my hand flared, its green light surging brighter, and the shadows recoiled slightly, their forms distorting as though the light was painful. I held it up instinctively, my hand trembling, and took a step back. The hum faltered for a moment, and in that brief pause, I thought we might be able to escape. Then the whispers started. They were soft at first, threading through the air like a distant breeze. But they grew louder with each passing second, overlapping and echoing in a way that made my head ache. I couldn't understand the words. They weren't in any language I recognized. But the tone was unmistakable. It was a summons, a call that resonated deep in my chest and made my stomach turn. Logan moved first, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he were being pulled by an invisible thread. His eyes were wide and glassy, his expression blank, and he didn't seem to hear me when I called his name. He walked toward the shadows, toward the shapes that had stopped their restless movements, and now stood perfectly still, waiting. "Logan, stop," I shouted, my voice breaking, but he didn't even flinch. I ran after him, the pendant's light casting long, jagged shadows across the ground, and grabbed his arm just as he reached the edge of the clearing. His skin was cold, and his body stiffened under my touch, but he didn't turn to look at me. Instead, he lifted his hand, pointing toward the trees. "It's her," he whispered, his voice distant and hollow. "She's right there." I followed his gaze, my stomach dropping as I saw what he meant. A figure stood among the trees, her form partially obscured by the shifting shadows. Her hair was long and dark, her face pale and familiar, and my heart stopped as I recognized her. Sarah. ... But it couldn't be. She'd been gone for a year. We'd searched the woods, combed every inch of this cursed place, and found nothing. She couldn't be here now, standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And yet, there she was. "Logan, it's not real," I said, my voice shaking as I tightened my grip on his arm. "It's not her." He didn't respond. His body jerked suddenly, violently, and I was forced to let go as he stumbled forward, his movements erratic and uncontrolled. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with their venomous cadence, and the pendant's light flickered as though it were struggling against the weight of the sound. The shadows surged forward. They moved as one, a single, undulating mass that swallowed the clearing in an instant. I couldn't see the others anymore. Only darkness, suffocating and impenetrable. The hum became a roar, shaking the ground beneath my feet, and the pendant burned against my skin, its light flaring one last time before extinguishing completely. I was blind, deaf, lost in a void that felt alive, pulsing and breathing around me. The whispers became screams, raw and guttural, tearing through the air like jagged glass. I stumbled backward, my arms flailing as I tried to find something, anything, to anchor myself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The darkness lifted, and I was back in the clearing, gasping for air. The others were there too, but they looked different. Paler, their movements sluggish, as though they were waking from a nightmare. The pendant in my hand was cold and lifeless, its once vibrant glow reduced to nothing. The clearing was empty, the shadows were gone. But Sarah's figure still stood at the edge of the trees, her expression unreadable. She raised a hand, her fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion, and I felt my blood turn to ice. She was beckoning us. Oil. She was beckoning us. The clearing felt colder now, the air sharper, biting against my skin as though the forest itself had turned hostile. Sarah's figure stood at the edge of the trees, her hand still raised, the motion slow and deliberate, like she was calling us to her. Her pale face seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, but her eyes were wrong. They were dark, voids that reflected nothing, pulling every flicker of light like a black hole. I couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a fear so visceral. It felt like my legs were encased in cement. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat a deafening drum roll against the eerie silence. Logan, who had been trembling beside me moments ago, took a step toward her. His movements were sluggish, almost mechanical, like a marionette being tugged forward on invisible strings. I reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm to stop him, but his skin was icy and rigid beneath my fingers. He didn't even flinch. The girl, I died. The hum I'd heard before returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The pendant in my hand began to warm again, its faint glow returning as the symbols etched into its surface pulsed faintly, in rhythm with the sound. "Logan, stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but he didn't. He took another step, then another, his eyes fixed on Sarah with a glassy, unseeing stare. The hum grew louder, joined by the faint, familiar whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They coiled around me, threading into my thoughts, and I couldn't stop the images that flickered through my mind. Memories of Sarah, of the last time I saw her alive. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she'd looked at me that night, in the woods before she disappeared. The whispers twisted the memory, warping it into something darker. Her face was still there, but her smile had vanished, replaced by that same hollow, empty gaze. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, couldn't understand, but they felt wrong, sharp, like glass cutting through my mind. I shook my head, forcing the images away, and tightened my grip on Logan's arm. The pendant's glow flared slightly, and for a brief moment, Logan froze, his body trembling under my grasp. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward mine, and I saw it. Just a flicker of something human beneath the haze. Fear, desperation. Wah. Alu. Warm. And then, it was gone. The hum surged, drowning out everything else, and Logan wrenched free from my grip, stumbling toward Sarah. The others called after him, their voices panicked and frantic, but he didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. He stepped into the tree line, disappearing into the shadows that clung to her figure like a second skin. And then he was gone. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The air grew colder still, the sharp scent of earth and decay filling my nose. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The pendant's light flickered weakly, the warmth fading as the symbols on its surface dulled once more. "Logan!" Maddie's voice cracked, her hands cupped around her mouth as she called into the trees. "I'm will." There was no answer, just the silence, stretching and pressing down on us like a weight. Ethan moved to her side, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists, but even he looked shaken. I could see it in the way his shoulders hunched, the way his eyes darted toward the shadows. "We have to go after him," Maddie said, her voice trembling but resolute. She turned to me, her wide eyes pleading, "We can't just leave him." Emna, Shul, I wanted to argue, to tell her that following Logan would be suicide, but the words wouldn't come. The forest loomed before us, dark and impenetrable, and I could feel it, the wrongness of it, the way it seemed to shift and breathe, alive in a way that had nothing to do with nature. But I couldn't leave Logan either. I couldn't leave him to whatever had taken him. Without a word, I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and stepped toward the tree line, the pendant pulse faintly in my hand, as though responding to the decision, and I tightened my grip on it, the cool metal grounding me as I took another step. Ethan and Maddie followed, their footsteps hesitant, but determined. None of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The moment we crossed into the trees, the air changed. It was heavier here, thicker, and the faint hum returned, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. The shadows were deeper, darker, shifting at the edges of my vision in ways that made my stomach twist. The path ahead was narrow, lined with gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks, but it felt deliberate, as though it had been carved out just for us. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, threading through the air like ghostly fingers. I tried to block them out, but they were relentless, growing louder with each step we took. They didn't just surround us, they seeped into us, clawing at our thoughts and twisting them into something unrecognizable. I saw things that couldn't be real, flashes of movement in the trees, faces in the shadows, their hollow eyes staring at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. The pendant's light flickered weakly, its glow barely enough to push back the darkness, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The path ended abruptly, opening into a small clearing. At its center stood a tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was massive, its bark dark and twisted, with roots that jutted out of the ground like skeletal hands. Symbols were carved into its surface, the same ones that adorned the pendant, glowing faintly in the dim light. And there, at the base of the tree, was Logan. He knelt in the dirt, his head bowed, his hands resting on the tree's massive roots. His body was still, unnaturally so, and the shadows around him seemed to ripple and shift, drawn toward him like moths to a flame. The whispers swirled around the clearing, their tone changing, growing sharper, more insistent. "Logan," I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. My voice sounded small, fragile, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the clearing. He didn't respond. He didn't even move. He didn't even move. The pendant flared suddenly, its light surging with a brightness that made me flinch. The symbols on the tree pulsed in response, and the ground beneath me trembled. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and for a moment I thought the tree itself was breathing. Its massive trunk expanding and contracting with each pulse of light. And then Logan looked up. His eyes weren't his anymore. You be anymore. Logan's eyes were voids, dark and endless, swallowing the faint light from the pendant still pulsing weakly in my hand. They were nothing like the warm, familiar eyes I'd known all my life. These were hollow, hungry, and alien, staring back at me as if he were trying to see through me, to peel away the layers of my being and find something buried deep inside. The whispers surged, louder now, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that rattled my skull. My knees buckled under the weight of the sound, but I forced myself to stay upright, clutching the pendant so tightly that its edges bit into my palm. The symbols on the tree flared, their glow synchronizing with the whispers, each pulse sending a ripple through the air that made my chest ache. Logan moved, his head tilting sharply to the side, the motion too quick, too precise. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the tree behind him groaned, its massive trunk twisting as the carvings etched into its bark began to shift. They moved like living things, writhing and coiling into new shapes that made my stomach churn. The air grew colder, the ground beneath me trembling as the roots stretched further out, curling like claws around the edges of the clearing. Logan, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reach him or myself. My voice was swallowed by the growing hum, now deep and resonant, vibrating through my chest like the tolling of a massive, unseen bell. He stood slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he were being controlled by something else. His head snapped toward me, his dark eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded. The tree, the whispers, the cold. There was only Logan, and the thing wearing his face. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice layered, fractured, like multiple people speaking at once. The words hit me like a blow, reverberating through the air with an intensity that made my ears ring. It's already too late. The tree groaned again, louder this time, and the ground beneath me cracked, jagged fissures spreading outward from its roots. A thick, black substance oozed from the cracks, steaming as it spread across the dirt. It moved unnaturally, slithering toward us like a living thing, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. Maddie screamed, her voice cutting through the noise as she reached for Logan. But Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It's not him," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "That's not Logan." But it was him. It had to be. I refused to believe otherwise. Him, Bonies. I tightened my grip on the pendant, the metal warm against my skin, and took a shaky step forward. The whispers faltered slightly, their rhythm breaking, and the symbols on the pendant flared brighter. Logan, or whatever had taken him, hesitated, his head tilting again as if studying the light. The fissures widened, the black substance bubbling and hissing as it consumed the ground. The clearing began to collapse inward, the tree's roots pulling the earth down into an ever-growing pit. The whispers returned. angrier now, their voices sharp and accusing, each word digging into my mind like a blade. "Claire, move," Ethan shouted, his voice distant and muffled, as though I were hearing him through a thick wall. I felt his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. But I couldn't take my eyes off Logan. The void in his gaze flickered, just for a moment, and I thought I saw something, someone beneath the surface. Fear, pain, a silent plea. The pendant flared again, its light searing and bright, and the symbols on the tree pulsed violently in response. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and Logan screamed, the sound raw and inhuman, his body convulsed, his limbs jerking as though he were being torn apart from the inside. "Help me," he gasped, his voice cracking as he collapsed to his knees. The void in his eyes flickered again, brighter this time, and I felt something inside me snap. I lunged forward, the pendant burning hot in my hand, and pressed it against his chest. The light exploded outward, blinding and searing, and the clearing erupted in chaos. The tree writhed, its massive trunk splitting open to reveal a hollow, gaping wound, filled with the same black substance that oozed from the ground. The whispers turned to screams, and the air grew thick with the scent of burning wood and decay. Logan's body convulsed beneath my hand, his screams mixing with the chorus of voices that filled the air. The pendant's light grew brighter, brighter than I thought possible, until it consumed everything, the tree, the shadows, the black substance, all of it swallowed by the blinding glow. And then, silence. And when the light faded, I was on the ground, my body trembling as the cold seeped into my bones. The clearing was empty. The tree was gone, its massive roots reduced to ash, and the ground beneath me was solid once more. The whispers were gone too, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. I looked up and saw Logan lying a few feet away, his body still and motionless. Maddie and Ethan were beside him, their faces pale and drawn as they tried to rouse him. The pendant in my hand was dark, its symbols faint and lifeless, and for a moment I thought it was over. But Logan's eyes opened. They were his again, soft, brown, and human. But there was something else in them, too. Something darker, deeper, that made my stomach twist. He sat up slowly, his gaze flicking between us, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "It's not gone," he said, his words sending a chill down my spine. "It's still here, and it's waiting." Logan's words hung in the air, heavy and final, sinking into the silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. It wasn't just the warning in his voice. It was the certainty. The way his eyes, though his again, still held that lingering darkness, a shadow that refused to let go. My grip on the pendant tightened, its weight pulling against me, its symbols faintly warm against my skin, as though it too understood what he had said. "It's waiting." The clearing around us felt hollow, like the air had been drained and replaced with something thicker, heavier. The black substance that had consumed the ground was gone, but its memory lingered in the way the earth smelled burnt and wrong. Maddie knelt beside Logan, her hands trembling as she touched his arm, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Ethan stood a few steps away, his eyes scanning the tree line, his body tense like a spring, about to snap. "We can't stay here," Ethan said finally, his voice low but steady. "This place. It's not safe." Safe. The word felt meaningless now. Envelop, shivers, while there was no safety in this forest. Not in the clearing, not in the crumbling lodge we'd left behind. The hum was gone, but the silence it left behind was worse, pressing against us like a living thing, watching and waiting for the next moment to strike. Logan struggled to his feet, Maddie helping him up as his legs wobbled beneath him. He swayed slightly, one hand gripping her shoulder for balance, the other pressed against his chest. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and his gaze darted between us and the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "We have to finish it," Logan said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "The tree, the symbols, it's all connected. It's not just waiting, it's pulling us in." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. The pendant in my hand pulsed faintly, its light barely visible now, but the warmth had returned, steady and insistent. It wanted something, needed something, and I was terrified of what that might be. Maddie looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, but tinged with something else. "Hope. Claire," she said softly, her voice cracking. "What do we do?" I didn't know. The ground beneath us felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment, and the air was too thick, too still. But Logan was right. The symbols, the whispers, the hum. It wasn't over. The tree was gone, reduced to ash, but its presence lingered in the way the clearing seemed darker now, smaller, as though the forest was closing in. The pendant grew warmer in my hand, its pulse quickening. My thoughts raced, piecing together fragments of the journal, the carvings on the tree, the whispers that still echoed faintly in my mind. "There's something below us," I said finally, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The tree. It wasn't the source. It was a door. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. A door. To what? I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure I wanted one. But the ground beneath my feet trembled faintly, a subtle vibration that spread outward in waves, and I knew we didn't have a choice. Whatever was waiting below the surface, it wasn't going to stay there. Not for long. Nur, detained. The four of us moved together, crossing the clearing toward the faint outline of a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. The pendant's light flickered as we walked, illuminating the twisted roots and jagged stones beneath our feet. The trees grew closer the further we went, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The hum returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, vibrating through the air like a low, resonant heartbeat. The path ended at a jagged hole in the earth, its edges raw and uneven, as though it had been torn open by force. The air that rose from it was cold, damp, and laced with the faint, metallic tang of blood. The pendant flared in my hand, its light spilling down into the void, but it revealed nothing. Just an endless descent into darkness. "This is insane," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling as he stared into the hole. "We don't even know what's down there." It's not just down there," Logan said, his gaze fixed on the void. "It's everywhere. The forest, the whispers, the tree. They're all connected. This is where it starts, and this is where it ends." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The pendant burned hot against my skin, its symbols glowing brighter now, casting jagged shadows across the ground. It felt alive, vibrating in my hand like a second heartbeat, urging me forward, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Maddie was the first to move, stepping toward the edge of the hole with a determination that belied the fear etched across her face. "If this is where it ends," she said softly, "then let's end it." One by one, we descended into the void. The air grew colder, the deeper we went, the walls of the tunnel closing in around us, pressing against my shoulders and scraping my skin. The pendant's light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the jagged path ahead, but the hum grew louder, filling the space with its oppressive weight. My breaths came in short, shallow bursts, and the faint whispers began to creep back in, threading through the hum like veins of ice. Tunnel opened into a massive chamber, its walls carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The floor was uneven, slick with the same black substance that had oozed from the cracks above. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, its surface cracked and weathered, but unmistakably ancient. The air here was heavy, thick with an energy that made my skin crawl. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and the whispers surged, filling the chamber with their venomous cadence. The pendant in my hand flared brightly, its light cutting through the darkness, and the symbols on the walls pulsed in response. The ground trembled, and a deep, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere. "You cannot stop it," the voice said, its words reverberating through the air, through my chest. "You are already too late." The ground beneath the altar cracked, and from the fissure rose a shadow, tall and shapeless, its form flickering and shifting like smoke caught in a violent wind. Its eyes burned with the same green light as the pendant, and its voice filled the chamber, low and resonant. "You are mine." The shadow loomed above the altar, its form twisting and writhing as though it couldn't hold its shape. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with a piercing green light that seemed to sear into my mind, rooting me to the spot. The pendant in my hand flared again, its warmth surging through my palm, but it felt weak, fragile against the overwhelming presence filling the chamber. Ethan moved first, stepping in front of Maddie with a protective instinct that felt both noble and futile. His fists clenched at his sides, but I could see the tremor in his arms, the way his breath hitched as the shadow tilted its head toward him. It didn't move closer, but its presence pressed against us, suffocating and heavy, like the air itself was conspiring against our lungs. "You were never meant to see this," the voice said, resonating through the chamber. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a deep vibration that pulsed through the ground, the walls, the very marrow of my bones. The shadows along the edges of the room seemed to ripple in response, shifting and coiling like living things. The pendant in my hand burned hotter, the light flickering erratically, and I clutched it tighter, my knuckles whitening as I fought to hold on. The symbols on its surface shifted again, writhing like snakes, and I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me toward the altar, even as my body screamed to run. Maddie's voice broke through the hum, sharp and raw. "What do you want from us?" "She." The shadow didn't answer immediately. It tilted its head further, as though considering the question, and the silence stretched unbearably long. When it finally spoke, its voice was darker, more guttural, laced with an edge of something that felt like amusement. "You were brought here," it said. "Called here. You carry the key, but you do not understand the door." The ground trembled violently, a deep, resonant thrum that sent ripples through the black substance coating the floor. The altar cracked further, thin fractures spidering outward, and the light from the pendant surged in response. The symbols carved into the chamber walls glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the hum, and the whispers rose again, threading through the voice like an undercurrent of venom. Logan staggered, his hand braced against the wall as he gasped for air. His eyes met mine, wide with fear but clear, fully his own again. "Claire," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. "The pendant, it's connected to this place, to it." I nodded, though my mind was a storm of confusion and terror. I could feel the connection too, pulsing through the pendant, through the symbols, through me. It wasn't just a link, it was a chain binding us to this place, to this moment, to whatever horror had been waiting beneath the surface all along. The shadow's gaze turned to me, and I felt its attention like a physical weight. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, the pendant's light flaring brighter as the symbols on its surface writhed violently. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the shadow extended a tendril-like appendage, reaching toward me. "You will open it," it said, the words slamming into me like a physical force. "And I will rise." The pendant burned in my hand, its light searing as the symbols on the walls surged with energy. The altar groaned, and the cracks widened, revealing a swirling void beneath it, an abyss that pulsed with the same green light as the shadow's eyes. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing against my chest, my lungs, my thoughts. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "We have to do something," he shouted, his voice desperate, almost frantic. "Claire, the pendant. Use it. Stop this." I didn't know how. Wait. The pendant felt alive in my hand. Its warmth pulsing erratically, but it offered no answers, no guidance. The light from the abyss grew brighter, the hum shaking the chamber, and the shadow reared back, its form expanding as it prepared to strike. And then Logan moved. He stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute, and placed himself between the shadow and the rest of us. The light from the pendant flared again, and the shadow hesitated, its form flickering violently. Logan turned to me, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "You have to end this," he said, "whatever it takes." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand wrapping around mine, forcing the pendant's light to flare with blinding intensity. The shadow screamed, its voice fractured and furious, and the chamber erupted in chaos. The altar shattered, the ground beneath it collapsing inward, and the abyss surged upward, swallowing the air, the walls, everything. The pendant's light exploded outward, searing through the darkness, and the shadow dissolved into the void, its form unraveling as it was pulled back into the depths. The whispers fell silent, the hum fading into nothingness, and for a moment the chamber was still. When the light faded, I was on the ground, the pendant cold and lifeless in my hand. The chamber was gone, replaced by an open void of black stone and cold air. Logan lay a few feet away, his body motionless, his face pale. Maddie knelt beside him, shaking him gently, her voice trembling as she called his name. Ethan stood at the edge of the void, staring down into the swirling green light far below. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembling at his sides, and I could see the weight of what we'd done etched into his face. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I wasn't so sure. The pendant felt heavier now, its surface smooth and unmarked, as though the symbols had been burned away, but the faint pulse was still there, barely perceptible, a reminder that the door wasn't closed, not completely, and whatever lay on the other side was still waiting. The air in the void was still and heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The faint green glow from below cast eerie shadows across the jagged edges of the chasm, its light pulsating in rhythm with the pounding in my chest. My hands trembled as I clutched the pendant, its weight cold and lifeless now, like a piece of dead metal instead of the living artifact it had been moments ago. Logan lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Maddie hovered over him, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his chest, desperate to find some sign of life. Ethan stood near the edge of the abyss, his back to us, his shoulders rigid as he stared down into the swirling green void. None of us spoke. The silence felt too fragile, like the wrong word might shatter it and bring everything crashing down again. I forced myself to move, my legs weak beneath me, as I stumbled toward Logan. The pendant dangled from its chain, swaying with each step, its faint pulse barely noticeable now. I dropped to my knees beside him, my breath catching in my throat as I reached out, my fingers brushing against his wrist. His skin was cold, but there was a pulse. Faint, but steady. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by a fresh wave of fear. Logan was alive, but for how long? The shadow was gone, pulled back into the abyss, but the light below still pulsed, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. Not yet. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice sharp and brittle. He turned to face us, his expression hard, but his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "This place, it's not stable. If we stay here any longer..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The ground beneath us shifted, a deep, resonant tremor that sent cracks spidering outward from the edges of the chasm. The glow from the void intensified, casting the chamber in a sickly green light that seemed to seep into my skin, into my thoughts. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, threading through the air like ghostly fingers. Maddie looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Claire, what do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of the journal, the symbols, the words the shadow had spoken. The door isn't closed. The door isn't closed. Paused. The thought repeated over and over, a relentless drum beat in my mind. The pendant in my hand grew warm again, its faint pulse quickening, and I realized with a sickening clarity what it was telling me. The door could still be sealed, but it required something more. "Help me lift him," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Maddie hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the abyss, but she nodded, sliding her arms under Logan's shoulders as I took his legs. Together, we lifted him, his body limp and unresponsive, and began to move toward the tunnel we'd come through. The ground shook violently, another deep tremor that sent shards of stone crashing down from above. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their cadence rising to a frantic pitch. I could feel the pull of the void, a gravitational force that seemed to reach for us, dragging us back toward its glowing depths. We were almost to the tunnel when Logan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, their usual warmth clouded with something darker, something that made my stomach twist. He groaned, his voice low and strained, and his gaze locked onto mine. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure, you have to let me go." I froze, the weight of his words sinking into me like a stone. "Stone? What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "We're getting out of here. Together." He shook his head weakly, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. "It's still here, inside me. I can feel it." His eyes darted toward the pendant, his expression pained. "The door won't close as long as I'm still standing. You know that." Tears blurred my vision, and I shook my head, refusing to accept what he was saying. "There has to be another way," I said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "We can fight it, We can. You, envelop, legend. Claire, he interrupted, his voice firmer now. It's too late for me. But it doesn't have to be for you. The pendant flared suddenly, its light brighter than it had been in hours, and the whispers surged, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that made my head throb. The ground trembled violently, and the tunnel behind us began to collapse, massive chunks of stone falling away and blocking our only path to safety. Ethan grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not unkind. Claire, we don't have time for this, he said, his voice tight with urgency. If we don't move now, none of us are getting out. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked down at Logan. He was right. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something alien and malevolent beneath the surface. The shadow wasn't gone. It had simply taken root inside him, biding its time. Please, Logan said, his voice cracking. Don't let this thing win. The pendant grew searingly hot in my hand, the symbols on its surface glowing with an intensity that made the chamber feel brighter, more alive. I could feel its power, its demand, and I knew what it was asking me to do. I leaned down, pressing my forehead to Logan's, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry, I whispered. He smiled, a faint, grateful expression that broke my heart. Then the pendant's light surged, enveloping us in a blinding glow. The whispers turned to screams, sharp and piercing, and the ground beneath us fractured, splitting open as the void rose to consume everything. I pressed the pendant against Logan's chest, its heat scorching my skin, and he gasped, his body convulsing as the light engulfed him. The screams grew louder, more desperate, and the shadow inside him writhed, its form visible for a split second before it was pulled into the abyss. The light from the pendant flared one last time, and then everything went still. When the light faded, Logan was gone. I'm l'hiver, le siwin. The chamber was silent, the void below sealed, its green glow extinguished. The whispers were gone, the hum reduced to nothing more than a faint vibration in the air. The pendant lay cold and lifeless in my hand, its surface smooth and blank, the symbols burned away. Ethan and Maddie stood beside me, their faces pale and drawn, their expressions hollow. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We climbed back to the surface, in silence, the weight of what we'd lost hanging heavy over us. The forest was quiet, the clearing empty, but I could still feel it, the faint pulse of something deep below, waiting. The door was closed. And Amri, an interview hers, but it wasn't locked. The night air clung to my skin, damp and heavy, as I adjusted the strap of my camera bag and stared up at the looming silhouette of Blackridge Asylum. The building seemed to swallow the moonlight, its jagged edges cutting into the night like a knife. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in the stillness, and the soft crunch of gravel beneath our boots as we moved closer to the gaping maw of the front entrance. The others were quiet, not the usual banter or nervous jokes that came before these kinds of trips. Just the kind of silence that weighed on your chest, heavy and oppressive. I glanced back at Chris and Lena, their faces pale in the faint glow of the flashlights. Even Jamie, usually brimming with nervous energy, looked subdued, his jaw tight as he adjusted the gimbal on his camera. Blackridge had that effect. It wasn't just another abandoned building, another decaying relic for us to explore and stream for a few thousand views. This place had a reputation, one that went beyond the usual urban legend whispers. People didn't just avoid it, they warned us not to come here. They talked about voices in the walls, shadows that moved where there shouldn't be shadows, and that cold, bone-deep feeling that crawled under your skin and never quite left. We pushed through the rusted double doors, the hinges screaming in protest, and the air inside hit me like a wave, stale, metallic, and sharp, with a faint undercurrent of rot. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, crumbling plaster, and the faint glint of broken glass scattered across the floor. The long hallway stretched out before us, endless and suffocating, lined with rusted wheelchairs and overturned gurneys. Every step echoed, too loud, bouncing off the walls and fading into the void. My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breathing. The air was colder here, almost wet, and the sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance only made it worse. A faint scratching noise pulled my attention to the left, but when I turned my flashlight, there was nothing there, just the dark, the endless, suffocating dark. We moved deeper into the asylum, our footsteps careful and deliberate. The layout was a maze, hallways branching off in every direction, some ending abruptly in collapsed ceilings or walls that looked like they'd been clawed apart. My flashlight caught faded signs on the walls. Ward a pharmacy, staff only. But none of them pointed to the reason we were here, the forgotten ward. It wasn't marked on any of the asylum's blueprints, and even the most detailed accounts of Blackridge's history barely mentioned it. Just a handful of cryptic references buried in decades-old news articles. Yet, a fire, an evacuation, and a sealed section of the hospital that no one was supposed to enter. But that was what made it perfect. We weren't just here to explore. We were here to find it. Jamie's voice crackled softly over the walkie-talkie clipped to my vest. Anything? I lifted the mic, my voice low. Not yet. Keep moving. The hallway narrowed, and the peeling wallpaper gave way to cracked tiles that gleamed faintly in the light. The scratching noise returned, louder now, skittering along the edge of hearing, and I stopped in my tracks. Chris nearly bumped into me, muttering under his breath, but I didn't respond. My flashlight swung to the side, following the noise. But again, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out into the void. We turned a corner, and there it was. The elevator. It was ancient, its doors rusted and scratched, with a control panel that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The buttons were worn, the numbers barely legible, but one stood out. B3, etched in faint, jagged lines. It wasn't listed on any of the blueprints we'd studied, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Jamie reached the elevator first, his flashlight illuminating the jagged graffiti carved into the doors. It wasn't just random markings. It was deliberate. Symbols, crude and angular, some of them filled with what looked like soot or dried blood. The kind of symbols you'd see in movies, the ones that always came with warnings about things. You were better off leaving alone. He reached for the button. Jamie, wait. My voice was sharp, cutting through the oppressive quiet. But it was too late. The button clicked, and the elevator groaned to life, shuddering as it descended to meet us. The sound was deafening in the silence, metal grinding against metal, and I felt a knot of dread tighten in my chest. The doors slid open with a screech, revealing a dark, yawning cavity. The air that poured out was colder than anything we'd felt before, sharp and biting, carrying with it that same metallic tang that had lingered in the entrance hall. It was wrong, unnatural, like the elevator was exhaling. Chris hesitated. Ben, are we sure about this? No one answered. Jamie stepped inside first, his camera light cutting through the darkness, and one by one, we followed. The walls were lined with graffiti, the same symbols from the doors, repeated over and over, growing more erratic and desperate as they descended. The doors slid shut behind us with a finality that made my stomach twist, and the elevator jolted, beginning its descent. The hum was faint at first, just a low vibration beneath our feet, but it grew louder with each passing second, reverberating through the walls, through our bones. The air felt heavier the deeper we went, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights on the panel flickered, and the elevator shuddered violently, throwing us against the walls. When it stopped, the doors slid open to reveal a corridor, bathed in faint, greenish light. The walls were damp, streaked with dark stains that looked like they had bled from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something acrid, something that burned the back of my throat. The forgotten war. We stepped out, our footsteps muffled on the slick, uneven floor. The corridor stretched out before us, lined with rusted doors, each marked with symbols and numbers that seemed to writhe under the flashlight beams. A faint whispering sound filled the air, threading through the hum, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from behind the doors or from somewhere deeper in the ward. Jamie raised his camera, his voice steady but strained. Where live? The whispers grew louder. The corridor stretched endlessly before us, its walls lined with rusted doors that seemed to lean inward, as though the building itself were closing in. My flashlight flickered against the damp tiles, the beam catching glints of moisture that oozed from the crack. The air was colder here, almost wet, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My heart pounded, and I gripped the camera tighter, trying to focus on the steady hum of its recording light. The whispers were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. The drain grew, but as we moved deeper into the corridor, they grew louder. Fragmented words, too garbled to make sense, like a radio stuck between stations. I glanced at the others. Hey, Jamie's camera light bobbed. Ahead of me, steady but jittering slightly, as he scanned the doors on either side. Chris and Lena stayed close behind, their footsteps slower, hesitant, as though they were trying to move without being heard. We stopped in front of a door near the middle of the hallway. It looked like the others, rusted, warped, and streaked with dark stains that dripped down to the floor. But this one was different. A small circular window in the center of the door was covered in a thick layer of grime, but I could just make out the faint outline of something on the other side. My flashlight beam caught on the glass, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Something small and quick, darting out of view. Jamie leaned in, wiping at the glass with his sleeve. But the grime was too thick to clear. "It's locked," he muttered, his voice low and strained. A metallic clang echoed from deeper down the corridor, the sound bouncing off the walls and fading into the hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. My stomach tightened, and I felt a bead of sweat trail down the back of my neck despite the cold. We froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to listen. The clang came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping noise, like metal dragging across concrete. It was slow, deliberate, and far too close. I turned, swinging my flashlight down the hallway, but the beam revealed nothing, just the endless stretch of rusted doors and shadows that seemed to shift and ripple at the edges of the light. "We should keep moving," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Jamie nodded, pulling away from the door, and we pressed on, the whispers growing louder with each step. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were layered, overlapping voices that seemed to come from behind every door, seeping through the cracks in the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with a kind of anguish that made my skin crawl. Chris stopped suddenly, his flashlight fixed on a door near the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, the rusted hinges barely holding it in place, and a faint glow spilled out from the gap. The light wasn't natural. It was pale and greenish, like the phosphorescent glow of something rotting. "What the hell is that?" Lena whispered, her voice tight with barely contained panic. No one answered. Jamie stepped forward, his camera trained on the door, and nudged it open with the toe of his boot. The door creaked, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, and the glow intensified, spilling out into the corridor like a sickly fog. I held my breath as the door swung inward, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the tiles with what looked like nails or something sharper. words layered over each other in chaotic spirals, crisscrossing and overlapping until they were almost unreadable. The symbols were there too, scattered between the words, their sharp angles and looping curves etched deep into the walls. The floor was littered with crumpled papers, broken syringes, and shards of glass that gleamed faintly in the greenish light. In the center of the room was a single metal chair, bolted to the floor. Thick leather straps hung limply from its armrests, stained dark with something that had seeped into the cracks. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound filled the room, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from the ceiling. I tilted my flashlight upward, and my breath caught in my throat. There were marks on the ceiling, long, jagged scratches that ran from one corner of the room to the other, converging above the chair. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, one that was eerily similar to the symbols on the walls. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and my flashlight flickered. I heard Lena whisper my name, her voice trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scratches. The light flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move. A shadow that didn't belong, twisting and shifting just out of reach. "Claire, we need to go," Chris said, his voice sharp and urgent. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back into the corridor, and the spell was broken. I stumbled, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls, and we backed away from the door as the tapping continued, louder now, almost frantic. The whispers surged, filling the hallway with a rising tide of noise that pressed against my skull. The floor beneath us trembled faintly, a low vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. My flashlight flickered again, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it would go out completely. And then the door slammed shut behind us, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a gunshot. We ran. We ran. The whispers chased us, their voices rising to a crescendo as we stumbled back toward the elevator. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors leaning closer, the walls pressing in, and the greenish light followed us like a shadow, flickering at the edges of my vision. We reached the elevator just as the hum reached its peak, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. Jamie slammed his hand against the button, and the doors slid open with a groan. We piled in, the walls shaking as the elevator jolted to life, and the doors slid shut, cutting off the whispers in an instant. The silence was deafening. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, the pendant around my neck cold and heavy against my skin. The others were pale, their faces streaked with sweat, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The elevator began to ascend, the hum fading into the background. But the cold, damp air still clung to us like a second skin. The green light was gone, but I could feel it lingering just beneath the surface, waiting. And somewhere below us, the whispers began again. The corridor stretched endlessly before us, its walls lined with rusted doors that seemed to lean inward. as though the building itself were closing in. My flashlight flickered against the damp tiles, the beam catching glints of moisture that oozed from the cracks. The air was colder here, almost wet, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My heart pounded, and I gripped the camera tighter, trying to focus on the steady hum of its recording light. The whispers were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. But as we moved deeper into the corridor, they grew louder. Fragmented words, too garbled to make sense, like a radio stuck between stations. I glanced at the others. Jamie's camera light bobbed ahead of me, steady but jittering slightly as he scanned the doors on either side. Chris and Lena stayed close behind, their footsteps slower, hesitant, as though they were trying to move without being heard. We stopped in front of a door near the middle of the hallway. It looked like the others, rusted, warped, and streaked with dark stains that dripped down to the floor. But this one was different. A small circular window in the center of the door was covered in a thick layer of grime, but I could just make out the faint outline of something on the other side. My flashlight beam caught on the glass, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, something small and quick, darting out of view. Jamie leaned in, wiping at the glass with his sleeve. But the grime was too thick to clear. "It's locked," he muttered, his voice low and strained. A faint metallic clang echoed from deeper down the corridor, the sound bouncing off the walls and fading into the hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. My stomach tightened, and I felt a bead of sweat trail down the back of my neck. Despite the cold, we froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to listen. The clang came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping noise, like metal dragging across concrete. It was slow, deliberate, and far too close. I turned, swinging my flashlight down the hallway, but the beam revealed nothing, just the endless stretch of rusted doors and shadows that seemed to shift and ripple at the edges of the light. "We should keep moving," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Jamie nodded, pulling away from the door, and we pressed on, the whispers growing louder with each step. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were layered, overlapping voices that seemed to come from behind every door, seeping through the cracks in the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with a kind of anguish that made my skin crawl. Chris stopped suddenly, his flashlight fixed on a door near the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, the rusted hinges barely holding it in place, and a faint glow spilled out from the gap. The light wasn't natural. It was pale and greenish, like the phosphorescent glow of something rotting. "What the hell is that?" Lena whispered, her voice tight with barely contained panic. No one answered. No one answered. Jamie stepped forward, his camera trained on the door, and nudged it open with the toe of his boot. The door creaked, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, and the glow intensified, spilling out into the corridor like a sickly fog. I held my breath as the door swung inward, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the tiles with what looked like nails, or something sharper. Words layered over each other in chaotic spirals, crisscrossing and overlapping until they were almost unreadable. The symbols were there too, scattered between the words, their sharp angles and looping curves etched deep into the walls. The floor was littered with crumpled papers, broken syringes, and shards of glass that gleamed faintly in the greenish light. In the center of the room was a single metal chair, bolted to the floor. Thick leather straps hung limply from its armrests, stained dark with something that had seeped into the cracks. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound filled the room, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from the ceiling. I tilted my flashlight upward, and my breath caught in my throat. There were marks on the ceiling, long, jagged scratches that ran from one corner of the room to the other, converging above the chair. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, one that was eerily similar to the symbols on the walls. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and my flashlight flickered. I heard Lena whisper my name, her voice trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scratches. The light flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow that didn't belong, twisting and shifting just out of reach. "Claire, we need to go," Chris said, his voice sharp and urgent. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back into the corridor, and the spell was broken. I stumbled, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls, and we backed away from the door as the tapping continued, louder now, almost frantic. The whispers surged, filling the hallway with a rising tide of noise that pressed against my skull. The floor beneath us trembled faintly, a low vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. My flashlight flickered again, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it would go out completely. And then the door slammed shut behind us, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a gunshot. We ran. The whispers chased us, their voices rising to a crescendo as we stumbled back toward the elevator. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors leaning closer, the walls pressing in, and the greenish light followed us like a shadow, flickering at the edges of my vision. We reached the elevator just as the hum reached its peak, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. Jamie slammed his hand against the button, and the doors slid open with a groan. We piled in, the walls shaking as the elevator jolted to life, and the doors slid shut, cutting off the whispers in an instant. The silence was deafening. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, the pendant around my neck cold and heavy against my skin. The others were pale, their faces streaked with sweat, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The elevator began to ascend, the hum fading into the background, but the cold, damp air still clung to us like a second skin. The green light was gone, but I could feel it lingering just beneath the surface, waiting, and somewhere below us, the whispers began again. "Better ye do veli valis vol days." This chapter intensifies the tension and mystery, pulling the reader deeper into the unfolding horror while maintaining a seamless narrative flow. Let me know if you'd like refinements. You said, en ibibte Schudum. Tum sie, komtom, göttelei Schandung, tuhani tilpidesi. Wit beënkar, mr, anger, Schanding 3, besemting tn, ha hau, da, di en anger. Shuitaye, tingun, fuhu, ha han, bend, len, duntia, hani, YouTube, gunchiatan, kas, honivit han, videolien, ChatGPT said, Chak, peeped. Here's the continuation of the story, seamlessly following Chapter 2. The elevator groaned as it carried us upward, its rusty cables trembling with each jolt. My legs felt weak, and I pressed myself against the cold metal wall. The pendant around my neck now completely still. My flashlight flickered in my hand, the weak beam casting jagged shadows that seemed to ripple across the worn surface of the elevator doors. The others were quiet, the adrenaline from our frantic escape slowly giving way to a suffocating tension. Chris leaned against the opposite wall, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Lena stood in the corner, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. Jamie sat on the floor, his camera resting in his lap, his eyes unfocused, as if trying to process what we had just seen. The hum returned. It was faint at first, barely more than a vibration beneath our feet, but it grew steadily louder, resonating through the elevator like a living thing. I straightened, gripping my flashlight tighter as the walls seemed to shudder with each pulse of sound. The floor beneath us jolted, and the elevator ground to an abrupt halt, the overhead light flickering before plunging us into darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. No. The air inside the elevator felt heavier, pressing against my chest, and I struggled to breathe through the suffocating silence. Then, Jamie's voice broke the stillness, low and trembling. Why did it stop? No one answered. My flashlight wavered as I pointed it at the control panel. The buttons were unlit, the panel dead, and I could see faint smears of grime where Jamie's fingers had pressed the buttons earlier. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the air, and I felt it deep in my chest, a low, relentless thrum that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. Lena whimpered softly, and Chris moved to the doors, pressing his ear against the rusted metal. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum. I strained to listen, my pulse pounding in my ears. At first, I heard nothing, just the hum and the faint creak of the elevator cables straining against the weight. But then it came, a faint scratching sound, distant but deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal. It wasn't coming from above or below us. It was coming from somewhere just beyond the elevator doors. I stepped closer, my breath catching as the scratching grew louder. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it made my skin crawl. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed my palm against the cold metal. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint tapping sound that echoed through the still air. Chris stepped back, his face pale in the dim light of my flashlight. "Something's Out there. Jamie scrambled to his feet, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice rising with panic. "We can't just stay here." I shook my head, forcing myself to stay calm. The elevator's dead," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Even if we get the doors open, we don't know where we are. It's safer to stay here until..." The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against us like a physical weight. Then, with a deafening screech, the elevator shuddered violently, the floor lurching beneath our feet. I stumbled, my flashlight clattering to the ground as the overhead light flickered back to life, casting the small space in a sickly yellow glow. The elevator doors slid open. What lay beyond wasn't the corridor we'd entered from. Shoot would stuff me warm he'd entered from. The walls were blackened, streaked with soot and rust, and the floor was covered in a thick, viscous liquid that glistened in the weak light. The air was colder, sharper, and carried the faint metallic tang of blood. Symbols were scrawled across the walls, the same jagged shapes we'd seen in the room before, but here they were larger, more chaotic, as if carved by trembling hands in a desperate frenzy. "Where the hell are we?" Jamie whispered, his voice trembling. None of us moved. The open doorway seemed to beckon, the shadows just beyond the threshold shifting and writhing like living things. The hum was louder here, resonating through the floor, the walls, and my very bones. The pendant around my neck grew warm, its faint pulse returning, and I felt a sickening pull in my chest, like an invisible thread tugging me forward. Lena took a step back, her hands shaking as she clutched at Chris' arm. "We can't go out there," she said, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "We need to close the doors. We need to." The lights flickered again, and the hum rose to a deafening pitch. My head throbbed, the noise pressing against my skull, and I dropped to my knees, clutching the pendant as if it could shield me. The symbols on the walls outside the elevator glowed faintly, their sharp angles twisting and shifting under the flickering light. And then something moved. It was fast, too fast to see clearly, a blur of shadow that darted across the open doorway. Lena screamed, and Jamie stumbled back, his camera pointed shakily at the corridor beyond. The movement stopped, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to settle. Then, slowly, deliberately, a figure stepped into view. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over jagged bones, and its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if studying us. The face was wrong, its features warped and indistinct, but the eyes, two hollow voids, bored into me, piercing and unrelenting. The pendant burned hot against my chest, and the figure's head snapped toward me, its movements jerky and inhuman. The hum seemed to sync with its gaze, pulsing violently, and I felt a wave of nausea roll through me as the symbols on the walls flared brighter. It took a step forward, the elevator doors slammed shut. We were plunged into darkness once more, the hum fading into a low, resonant vibration. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The others were silent, their breaths shallow and uneven, and I could feel the weight of their fear pressing down on me. The elevator jolted again, beginning its ascent, but the warmth of the pendant lingered, a constant reminder of what we had just seen. I didn't know what was waiting for us at the top, but one thing was certain. We weren't alone. The elevator jolted to a stop, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But the air felt wrong. Thicker somehow, heavier. My chest tightened as I gripped the pendant hanging from my neck. It was cold again, its faint pulse gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting. The doors slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing another hallway, nearly identical to the one we had left behind. The same damp tiles, the same rusted doors with streaks of grime. But something was different. The shadows here seemed to move, slithering along the walls just at the edge of my vision. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their flickering casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Jamie stepped out first, his camera clutched tightly in both hands, the red recording light blinking faintly in the dim corridor. "We need to keep moving," he muttered, more to himself than to the rest of us. His voice was tight, forced, as though he was trying to convince himself that this was just another exploration, just another video. Chris followed, his steps hesitant, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the walls. Lena clung to him like a lifeline, her breath shallow and rapid, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. I lingered in the elevator for a moment longer, my feet refusing to move. The pendant felt heavier now, pulling against the chain as though it wanted to drag me back. "Claire." "Hey?" Jamie's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. He was further down the hall now, his flashlight pointed at a door, slightly ajar. "There's something in here." The sound of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something primal. I stepped out of the elevator, the damp tiles cold beneath my boots, and followed the others as they gathered around the door. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Jamie pushed the door open, and the hinges creaked in protest. The room beyond was small, barely more than a storage closet, but it was filled with shelves, lined with dusty jars and rusted instruments. The walls were covered in faded, yellowing papers, each one scrawled with notes and symbols that I couldn't understand. A faint hum filled the space, not loud, but constant, vibrating through the air like a heartbeat. At the center of the room was a table, its surface stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. On it lay a book, its leather cover cracked and weathered with age. The edges of the pages were charred, as though someone had tried and failed to destroy it. Jamie reached for the book, his hand trembling as he brushed away the layer of dust. The pendant around my neck grew warm, its pulse returning faintly, and my stomach twisted as he opened the cover. The pages were filled with dense, spidery handwriting, interspersed with crude sketches of symbols and diagrams that made my skin crawl. "What is this?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamie didn't answer. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed, his camera still recording. "It's notes," he said finally, his voice hollow. "And experiments, rituals, and Terebuka." The hum grew louder. "Hey!" I took a step closer, my eyes scanning the open pages. One passage caught my attention, written in bold, jagged letters that seemed to leap off the page. "The seal must never be broken. Should the Zil awaken, the ward will fall, and the shadow will rise." My chest tightened, and I felt the walls of the room close in around me. The pendant burned hotter now, its pulse quickening, and the faint whispers returned, threading through the hum like ghostly fingers. Jamie turned the page, revealing a sketch of a symbol that looked eerily familiar. Sharp angles and looping curves that matched the carvings we'd seen in the corridors. Chris stepped back, shaking his head. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to leave." Before anyone could respond, the hum surged, and the lights overhead flickered violently. The shadows in the room shifted, stretching and twisting along the walls, and a loud metallic screech echoed from somewhere deeper in the ward. My heart leapt into my throat as the floor beneath us trembled, and the pendant's light flared, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The others didn't need to be told twice. "Ah, Nivivaniol, Buo, Geist." Jamie slammed the book shut, tucking it under his arm, as we bolted from the room. The corridor outside was darker now, the lights flickering in and out, and the whispers grew louder, rising to a chaotic crescendo that drowned out everything else. We ran, our footsteps echoing down the hallway, the shadows following us, growing closer with each flicker of the lights. The air was freezing now, each breath stabbing at my lungs, and the walls seemed to ripple as though the ward itself was alive. My flashlight beam caught on one of the doors, and I saw it, another symbol, carved deep into the rusted surface, glowing faintly with that same sickly green light. A sharp scream pierced the air, and I turned to see Lena stumble, her flashlight clattering to the floor. She clawed at the wall, her face pale and streaked with tears, as something dark and shapeless wrapped around her ankle, pulling her back toward one of the open doors. "Help me!" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Chris grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, but the shadow tightened its grip, dragging her closer to the door. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling, as I reached for the pendant. Its light flared brighter than ever, and the shadow recoiled, releasing Lena with a guttural hiss. She scrambled to her feet, sobbing, as Chris pulled her forward. The pendant's light flickered, dimming again, and the whispers surged, louder now, more insistent. The corridor stretched endlessly before us, the exit nowhere in sight, and I felt the weight of the ward pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. We weren't going to make it. The air grew colder with every step we took, the corridor stretching endlessly before us. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the walls, catching glimpses of jagged symbols and dark stains that seemed to pulse faintly in the flickering light. The whispers had become a constant now, an oppressive murmur that seemed to seep into my skull, threading through my thoughts and twisting them into something I barely recognized. Lena clung to Chris, her breathing ragged, her sobs quiet but unrelenting. Jamie was ahead of us, his camera shaking in his hands as he scanned the endless hallway. None of us spoke, but the silence between us was loud, filled with the weight of what we'd seen and what we couldn't explain. The floor beneath my boots was slick, the damp tiles coated in a thin layer of something that smelled faintly metallic. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was pressing down on us, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The pendant around my neck burned faintly, its warmth a small, steady reminder that whatever was pulling us deeper into this place wasn't finished with us yet. Jamie stopped suddenly, his flashlight fixed on something at the end of the hallway. I followed his gaze, my stomach twisting as I saw it. A door, larger than the others, with heavy metal hinges and deep scratches carved into its surface. The edges of the door were lined with symbols, more intricate and violent than the ones we'd seen before, their sharp angles glowing faintly in the dim light. "This has to be," Jamie muttered, his voice low and hoarse. He moved toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his camera trained on the jagged carving. Chris shook his head, his grip on Lena tightening. "Jamie, don't. We don't know what's behind it." Jamie didn't respond. He reached the door, his flashlight beam catching on a rusted plaque bolted just above the handle. The letters were worn and uneven, but I could still make them out. Ward B3, restricted access. Below it, scratched into the metal, were 3 words that made my blood run cold. "Do not enter." Jamie reached for the handle. "Everyone bis. Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He paused, looking back at me with a mixture of defiance and fear. What if this is what it wants us to do? What if we're opening something that was meant to stay closed? The whispers surged, louder now, overlapping and chaotic, and the symbols on the door flared brighter. Jamie hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, but the hum beneath our feet grew stronger, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to push us forward, urging us closer. "We don't have a choice," he said, finally, his voice trembling. "We have to know." Before I could stop him, he turned the handle. The door groaned, its hinges screaming in protest, and the air that spilled out was freezing, sharp, and acrid. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the walls and floor, and I felt my knees weaken as Jamie pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, far larger than I expected. Eptoptial. The walls were lined with shelves filled with decayed books and rusted medical equipment, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a large circular platform, its edges carved with the same symbols that had haunted us throughout the war. The floor on the platform was cracked and uneven, and a faint greenish light seeped through the fissures, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. But it was what was on the platform that made my breath catch. A figure lay motionless, strapped to the surface with heavy leather restraints. Its body was thin and emaciated, its skin pale and stretched tightly over jagged bones. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its face obscured by a black hood that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. The restraints were old and frayed, but they held firm, and I couldn't tell if the figure was alive or dead, or something in between. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their voices filled with a desperate urgency that made my head throb. The symbols on the platform glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the hum that now seemed to emanate from the figure itself. A narrow stare. Jamie moved closer, his camera trained on the platform, and I grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Inte jul, da. We don't know what this is. It's the source," he said, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and fascination. "This is what the journal was talking about. The vessel." Chris pulled Lena back, his flashlight darting nervously across the room. "Whatever it is, we need to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've already gone too far." But the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the room and sending a shiver down my spine. The hum surged, the symbols on the platform flaring brighter, and the figure's head snapped toward us. It moved. The leather restraints creaked as the figure writhed, its body convulsing violently against the bonds. The hood slipped slightly, revealing the edge of a face, pale with deep, hollow voids where its eyes should have been. The whispers became screams, raw and guttural, and the green light beneath the platform surged, spilling out across the room like a living thing. The pendant around my neck burned hotter than ever, its light flaring so brightly that I had to shield my eyes. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its voice layered and fractured, and the room seemed to tilt as the hum reached a deafening crescendo. "We have to stop it," Jamie shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "How?" Chris yelled, his grip tightening on Lena as she sobbed, her hands pressed over her ears. The pendant pulsed violently, its heat searing against my skin, and I felt a pull deep in my chest. A connection I couldn't explain, something ancient and unrelenting. The symbols on the walls twisted and writhed, their angles shifting into patterns I couldn't comprehend, and the room itself seemed to contract, the shadows closing in around us. I didn't know what to do. Lewis, energy, but I knew one thing for certain. The seal was breaking. And the room shuddered as the hum turned into a low, resonant roar that reverberated through my chest, shaking me to my core. The green light beneath the platform flared, casting grotesque shadows across the walls, and the figure on the slab convulsed violently, its limbs jerking against the restraints. The symbols carved into the platform pulsed in time with the light, their jagged lines glowing with an intensity that made my eyes water. Jamie stumbled backward, his camera slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. "What's happening?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The pendant around my neck burned like fire, the heat searing into my skin as the symbols etched into its surface began to glow, casting sharp beams of light that cut through the darkness. The pull in my chest was stronger now, an invisible force that dragged me toward the platform, toward the writhing figure that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. The whispers returned, louder and more fragmented, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head throb. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, invasive and relentless, threading through my mind and dredging up memories I didn't want to face. Flashes of faces, moments, regrets, things I'd buried long ago. The figure on the platform let out a guttural scream, its voice fractured and layered, and the restraint snapped with a deafening crack. It rose slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were being controlled by invisible strings. The hood slipped further, revealing more of its face, pale, skeletal, and utterly devoid of humanity. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and I felt an icy grip close around my heart. The shadows in the room shifted, pooling at the creature's feet before spreading outward, like ink spilled across water. They moved with purpose, coiling around the edges of the room, and creeping closer with every flicker of the light. Lena screamed, clutching at Chris as the shadows reached for her, their edges sharp and jagged like broken glass. "Stay together," Chris shouted, his voice filled with panic. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness, but doing nothing to stop the advancing shadows. The pendant pulsed violently, its light surging as the pull in my chest became unbearable. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air as the room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in around me. The symbols on the walls and floor twisted and writhed, their shapes distorting into something unrecognizable. And I realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't just markings. They were alive. Jamie grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Claire, we have to do something," he yelled, his voice desperate. "That thing, it's breaking free." I looked at the platform, at the creature that now stood fully upright, its towering form silhouetted against the blinding green light. The shadows coiled around it like living armor, shifting and writhing as it took a step forward. The hum grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath us, and the pendant's light flared brighter, its heat searing through my chest. The creature raised one elongated arm, its skeletal fingers curling toward me, and I felt the pull intensify. My legs moved on their own, dragging me forward, closer to the platform, closer to the thing that had been waiting for us all along. "Stop," Chris yelled, grabbing my other arm and pulling me back. But the force was too strong. The pendant burned brighter, its symbols pulsing violently, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just reacting to the creature. It was feeding it. The shadows surged, slamming into Chris and sending him sprawling to the ground. Lena screamed again, her voice raw with terror, as the darkness coiled around her legs, pulling her toward the platform. Jamie lunged for her, grabbing her arms and dragging her back, but the shadows tightened their grip, cutting into her skin like jagged teeth. I reached for the pendant, desperate to tear it from my neck, but the chain tightened, digging into my throat. The creature's hollow eyes bore into me, its fractured voice filling the room with words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my soul. "You opened the seal," it said, the words layered and distorted. "No, you will pay the price." The platform cracked, jagged fissures spreading outward as the green light surged, consuming the room in its sickly glow. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the pendant's light flared one last time before exploding outward, blinding and searing. When the light faded, the room was silent. I was on the ground, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The pendant lay cold and lifeless against my skin, its symbols dim and unreadable. The platform was gone, replaced by a gaping void that pulsed faintly with green light, its edges jagged and raw. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but the shadows lingered, curling around the edges of the room like smoke. Lena sobbed quietly, clutching her knees to her chest as Chris knelt beside her, his face pale and streaked with blood. Jamie sat, slumped against the wall, his camera broken at his feet, his hands trembling as he stared at the void. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice hollow. "It's never over." The hum returned, faint but steady, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The pull in my chest was gone, but the weight of the pendant remained, a constant reminder of what we had unleashed. The green light from the void flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room, and I realized with a sinking feeling that Jamie was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. The silence was unbearable, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum vibrating through the floor. The green light from the void pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows across the walls, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The void seemed alive, its edges rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to push myself upright, my legs trembling beneath me. Jamie was the first to move. He staggered to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes fixed on the gaping void at the center of the room. "It's still open," he muttered, his voice trembling. "We didn't stop it." I didn't respond. The pendant around my neck was cold now, its surface smooth and lifeless, but I could still feel its weight pulling at me, an unrelenting reminder of what we'd unleashed. The shadows at the edges of the room shifted restlessly, coiling and uncoiling like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We have to leave," Chris said, his voice hoarse and raw. He helped Lena to her feet, his arm wrapped protectively around her as she clung to him, her body shaking. "No." Jamie turned to him, his expression frantic. "And go where?" You think this thing is just going to let us walk away? He gestured to the void, his voice rising with desperation. It's not over. It's not going to stop. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through the air and vibrating in my chest. The shadows surged, spreading across the walls, and the green light from the void intensified, spilling out across the floor in jagged beams. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the pendant flared faintly against my chest, its symbols glowing weakly. Then I heard it, the voice. It was faint at first, buried beneath the hum and the whispers, but it grew louder with each passing second, layered and fractured, impossible to place. It wasn't coming from the void. It was coming from within me. Survival. You brought us here. The words slammed into my thoughts, sharp and unrelenting, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the room spun around me. The voice was everywhere, threading through my mind, pulling at memories and fears I'd buried deep. Images flashed before my eyes, faces I'd forgotten, moments I'd tried to erase, all of them twisted and distorted, their edges blurred by shadow. You opened the seal. You will close it. The green light flared, and the void trembled, its surface rippling violently as a shape began to rise from its depths. It was massive, its form shifting and flickering like smoke, its edges jagged and undefined. The air grew colder, sharper, and the shadows recoiled as the figure took shape, its presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. The pendant burned against my skin, its symbols flaring brighter, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the void. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me, into the very core of who I was. Claire. Chris' voice cut through the chaos, and I turned to see him reaching for me, his face twisted with fear. Don't let it take you. But it was too late. The pull was too strong, the pendant's heat too intense, and my feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the edge of the void. The shadows surged, coiling around my legs, and I stumbled, falling to my knees just inches from the green light. The figure loomed above me, its form flickering violently as the symbols on the pendant pulsed in time with the light. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the voice returned, sharper this time, each word cutting through me like glass. The seal must close. Eulen Soma. Close. One must stay. I understood. Then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. The seal wasn't just broken. It was incomplete. It needed balance. A trade. The pendant burned brighter, its symbols glowing with a blinding intensity, and the pull in my chest became unbearable. The shadows around me twisted violently, their edges cutting into my skin. But I didn't fight them. I couldn't. The choice had already been made. I turned to the others, my voice steady, despite the chaos. You need to go. Chris' eyes widened, and he shook his head, his grip on Lena tightening. No. No, we're not leaving you. We can. You can't stop this, I said, cutting him off. My voice was firm, but tears blurred my vision as the shadows dragged me closer to the void. This is the only way, Lena sobbed, her voice breaking, and Jamie stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. The pendant flared one last time, and the figure above me raised an elongated arm, its jagged fingers curling toward me. The seal will hold for now. Certain time, unable to the sisters. The words echoed through my mind as the shadows consumed me, pulling me into the void. The green light enveloped me, blinding and searing, and the last thing I saw was Chris pulling Lena toward the door, his face twisted with grief and rage. And then there was nothing. Dead. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The void was gone, replaced by a jagged scar in the floor that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. The shadows were still, their edges soft and undefined, and the pendant around my neck was cold, its symbols dark and lifeless. I was alone. The air was heavy, the silence suffocating, but I felt it, the hum, faint and distant, vibrating through the walls. The seal was closed, but it wouldn't hold forever. I could feel it, deep in my chest, a constant reminder of what I had sacrificed. The whispers were gone, but their echoes lingered, threading through the silence like veins of shadow. And as I stood in the empty room, the weight of the pendant pulling at my neck, I understood the truth. I wasn't the one who had survived. I was the one who had stayed. The GPS said it was the fastest route, avoiding traffic. The cheerful voice had announced before, rerouting us down an unmarked road. At first, none of us thought anything of it. The asphalt stretched out ahead, framed by towering trees that swayed in the wind. It looked like any other back road in rural West Virginia, quiet and empty, far removed from the sprawling highways we'd been driving all day. But the further we went, the more it felt wrong. The road narrowed, the pavement cracking and giving way to uneven gravel. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sunlight. The car's headlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed by the shadows that crept along the edges of the forest. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles pale, as I glanced at the GPS again. The screen flickered, the once crisp directions blurring into static. Recalculating, it said, but the voice sounded different now, distant, hollow, like it was coming from deep underwater. I tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach, focusing instead on the road ahead. The others were quiet, too quiet. Rachel sat beside me, her gaze fixed out the window, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. In the back seat, Eric and Maddie whispered to each other, their voices barely audible over the hum of the engine. Even the music we'd been blasting earlier was gone, the radio now filled with static that crackled faintly in the background. The fog came out of nowhere. One moment, the air was clear, the forest stretching out endlessly on either side. The next, a thick gray mist rolled in, swallowing the road and trees in an instant. I slowed the car, the tires crunching on gravel as I squinted through the windshield. The fog was unnatural, dense and swirling, and it carried a chill that seeped through the windows and into my bones. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the engine, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the car. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't coming from the car at all. It was outside, somewhere in the fog, faint and deliberate, like someone knocking softly on wood. Rachel stiffened beside me, her hand gripping the edge of her seat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding now, each beat loud and uneven, drowning out the tapping as it grew louder, more insistent. I slowed the car to a crawl, the headlights cutting feebly through the mist, and that's when I saw it. Avia stood in the middle of the road. It was barely visible through the fog, its shape distorted and hazy, but it was there, tall and unmoving, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. My foot slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop as the others jolted forward in their seats. The figure didn't move. I'll didn't see you'd say. I blinked, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. But the figure was still there. Its outline shifted slightly, flickering like static on a broken TV screen, but it stayed rooted in place. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the fog only thickened, wrapping around the car like a living thing. The tapping stopped. The figure dissolved into the mist. A sharp, metallic screech tore through the air, and the car shuddered violently. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered before dying completely, plunging us into silence. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands trembling, but the car wouldn't start. The headlights dimmed, leaving us in near darkness, the fog pressing against the windows. What the hell just happened? Eric's voice was sharp, laced with panic. I didn't answer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the road ahead, now empty except for the swirling mist. The air inside the car felt heavier, thicker, as though it was being siphoned away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the edge of the light. Rachel's hand shot out, gripping my arm tightly. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze to the rear-view mirror, my stomach lurching as I saw them. Faint glowing orbs drifting through the fog like lanterns held by invisible hands. There were dozens of them, scattered and shifting, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't headlights. They weren't anything I could explain. The whispers started then, faint and fragmented, threading through the stillness like ghostly fingers. They weren't coming from the radio or the engine. They were coming from outside, seeping through the fog, soft and distorted, like a distant conversation just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with a kind of anguish that made my skin crawl. Maddie whimpered, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, my throat dry, and fumbled for the door handle. The air hit me like a wall as I stepped out, cold and damp, the fog wrapping around me immediately. The ground beneath my boots felt uneven, the gravel slick and unstable, and the whispers grew louder, threading through the mist like veins of shadow. The lights were closer now, their glow brighter and more erratic, and I could feel them pulling at me, drawing me toward the edge of the road. My head throbbed, my thoughts muddled and fragmented, and the pendant around my neck grew warm, its surface pulsing faintly against my skin. The others followed reluctantly, their movements stiff and hesitant. Rachel clung to my arm, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, while Eric and Maddie stayed close behind, their flashlights cutting feebly through the mist. The car loomed behind us, dark and lifeless, its edges blurred by the fog. We tried to walk back the way we'd come, but the road stretched endlessly before us, the same cracked asphalt and leaning trees, repeating in an unrelenting loop. The whispers grew louder with every step, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were following us, drifting closer with each passing moment. It was then that I realized we weren't just lost. We were trapped. The road stretched endlessly, a narrow cracked line disappearing into the fog. Every step felt heavier, the damp air pressing against my skin and filling my lungs with each ragged breath. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the lights that hovered just out of reach, their glow flickering like distant lanterns. The whispers had grown louder, a constant murmur threading through the stillness, and I couldn't tell if they were coming from the forest or from somewhere inside my head. Rachel clung to my arm, her grip tight and unsteady, her flashlight beam jittered across the road, catching on the warped roots of trees and the glint of wet gravel. Behind us, Maddie and Eric walked in silence, their faces pale, their breaths shallow and strained. No one spoke. Words felt useless now, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the fog and the suffocating sound of the whispers. I don't know how long we walked. Minutes, hours. Time felt meaningless, slipping away like water through my fingers. The road never changed. It stretched on and on, the same cracks and patches of weeds, repeating like a looped film reel. The forest on either side seemed closer now, the trees leaning inward, their branches twisting unnaturally. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The faint light from our flashlights swallowed by shadows that moved with an unnerving fluidity. Then Rachel stopped. Her grip on my arm tightened, and I turned to see her staring at something on the ground, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice thin and brittle. I followed the beam of light, my stomach twisting as I saw it. A set of footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the damp gravel, but they were there. The prints were too large to be ours, the edges jagged and uneven, as though whatever had made them wasn't entirely human. They led off the road and into the forest, disappearing into the fog. Eric stepped closer, his expression tense. "We didn't pass those before," he said, his voice barely audible. "We're going in circles," Maddie whispered, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ha! Her eyes darted to the trees. The fear etched into her face, mirroring the unease that churned in my gut. "This road, it's not letting us lead." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew she was right. The road wasn't just endless. It was alive. The whispers surged, louder now, their voices overlapping and frantic. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, urgent, pleading. The lights in the fog flickered, their glow intensifying as they drifted closer, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. The pendant around my neck grew warm, its faint pulse sensing with the rhythm of my heartbeat, and I could feel it pulling at me, an invisible thread tugging me toward the forest. Rachel turned to me, her eyes wide and glassy. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The whispers weren't just background noise anymore. They were personal, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, threading through my memories. My own name echoed faintly, distorted and warped, like a recording played backward. The others stiffened as the whispers grew louder, the voices weaving together into a single, discordant chant. The lights surged forward. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the ground as the first of the orbs broke through the fog. Up close, they weren't just lights. They were something more, a shifting, pulsing glow that seemed to breathe, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. They hovered just above the ground, moving with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, and I could feel their heat against my skin, sharp and electric. Rachel screamed, her voice cutting through the rising whispers, and I turned to see her backing away, her flashlight beam darting wildly across the tree. "There's something there," she cried, pointing toward the forest. I followed her gaze, my heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing, just the dense wall of fog and the faint outlines of gnarled branches. But then it moved. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, flickered at the edge of the light, its form shifting and elongating as it melted into the darkness. "Run," I said, my voice hoarse and trembling. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the road, our footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement, the lights chasing us, their glow bright and unrelenting. The whispers followed, rising to a chaotic crescendo that filled the air, drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel them behind me, the heat of the lights, the cold press of the shadow, the oppressive weight of the forest closing in. The road seemed to stretch forever, its surface blurring beneath the frantic beam of my flashlight. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a living thing, and the world tilted as my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through my knees and palms as I scrambled to my feet. But the others had stopped ahead. Their flashlights pointed at something in the distance. "What is that?" Maddie asked, her voice trembling. I staggered toward them, my chest heaving, and saw it. A wooden sign stood at the edge of the road, its surface warped and weathered by time. The words carved into it were faint, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Turn back." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive weight of the air lifting, just enough for me to take a shaky step forward. But as my flashlight passed over the trees behind the sign, I saw them. More symbols, carved deep into the bark. They were crude and uneven, their sharp angles glowing faintly, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't warnings. They were wards. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than before, and the lights surged forward, their glow blinding. The pendant burned against my chest, its heat searing, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the forest. We weren't alone anymore. The glow from the lights cast long, flickering shadows across the road, twisting and bending into shapes that didn't make sense. They swayed in and out of view, like they were moving with purpose. But without a pattern I could follow. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled forward. The words on the warped sign burned into my mind. Turn back. But there was no way back. We'd tried, and the road had mocked us with its unending loop. There was only forward, into whatever this place had waiting for us. Rachel's grip on my arm tightened as the whispers surged again, louder and more chaotic, filling the air like a storm about to break. "Claire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's out there." I turned, my flashlight beam cutting across the trees. But the fog clung too tightly, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The symbols carved into the trunks seemed to pulse faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a cold, unnatural light. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow deeper in the forest, but it vanished before I could focus on it. "Keep moving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can't stay here." The others followed without question, their footsteps hesitant and uneven as we moved further down the road. The fog pressed in closer now, its chill wrapping around my skin, and the air was so thick it felt like breathing through water. The pendant around my neck pulsed faintly, its warmth growing stronger with every step, and I couldn't tell if it was warning me or guiding me deeper into the trap. Eric stopped abruptly, his flashlight swinging toward the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I froze, my heart pounding as I followed his gaze. The shadows beyond the tree line were shifting again, slow and deliberate, their movements too fluid to be human. The whispers rose, threading through the air like a tangible force. And for a moment, I thought I heard my own name, distorted and distant. "There," Maddie said, pointing toward the edge of the road. At first, I didn't see it, my eyes struggling to focus through the swirling fog. But then it appeared, a faint light, flickering like a candle flame, moving just beyond the reach of the trees. It wasn't like the other lights. This one was smaller, weaker, and it bobbed unevenly, as if carried by an unsteady hand. Before I could stop her, Maddie stepped forward, her flashlight beam fixed on the flickering glow. "Hello?" she called, her voice breaking. The light stopped. Everything went still. The fog hung motionless in the air. The whispers fell silent, and even the shadows seemed to freeze in place. My breath caught in my throat as the light began to move again. Closer this time, its glow growing brighter with each step. It was joined by another light, then another, until a line of them stretched through the forest, moving in perfect unison toward the road. "Rune," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Maddie didn't move. He didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the lights, her expression blank, as if she were in a trance. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the others, and she stumbled, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. The lights reached the edge of the road and stopped. For a moment, the world was silent again. The only sound, the ragged rhythm of my breathing. Then the lights surged forward, spilling onto the road like a tide of fireflies. They surrounded us, their glow so bright it burned my eyes, and I could feel their heat pressing against my skin, sharp and electric. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping and fragmented, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. My knees buckled under the weight of the sound, and I dropped to the ground, clutching the pendant as its heat flared against my chest. The lights circled us, moving faster and faster, their glow pulsing in time with the whispers. And I realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't just surrounding us. They were closing in. Rachel screamed, the sound piercing through the chaos, and I turned to see her pointing toward the center of the road. The shadows were there, coalescing into a shape that defied logic, its form flickering and shifting like static on a screen. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, and bent at unnatural angles, and its face, if it had one, was a void, a hollow nothingness that seemed to pull the light toward it. The pendant burned brighter, its symbols glowing with a blinding intensity, and the figure turned toward me, its head tilting in a slow, deliberate motion. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the center of the circle. And no matter how hard I fought it, my feet moved on their own, drawn to the creature that had been waiting for us all along. "Claire!" Eric shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. The contact broke the pull, and I stumbled, my vision swimming as the lights faltered for a moment, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. The shadows surged forward. They moved like a living thing, a wave of darkness that swallowed the road, and the lights scattered, their glow extinguished, one by one. The whispers turned to screams, raw and guttural, and the figure let out a low, resonant growl that shook the ground beneath us. "Go, go," I shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her to her feet. The others followed, their footsteps pounding against the pavement as we ran blindly down the road, the fog and shadows closing in behind us. The pendant flared one last time, its light cutting through the darkness. And for a moment, I thought we might have escaped. But the road ahead twisted, bending in an impossible angle, and when we rounded the corner, we were back where we'd started. The sign was there, its warped surface catching the faint light of our flashlights. The words were clearer now, carved deep into the wood, and as I stared at them, a single, suffocating thought consumed me. We were never getting out. The sign loomed before us, its carved warning etched deep into the warped wood. The road had betrayed us, leading us in endless circles, dragging us back to this cursed spot, no matter which direction we chose. We chose. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam catching on the faint symbols carved into the trees around us. They pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with the same sickly light as the pendant against my chest. Rachel sank to her knees, her hands covering her face, as she let out a choked sob. Maddie hovered beside her, her expression blank, her eyes glazed over as though she were no longer fully present. Eric stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his flashlight dangling uselessly at his side. No one spoke. The silence was heavier now, broken only by the faint hum that had become a constant companion. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows in the forest shifted restlessly, coiling and uncoiling like living things. The lights were gone, swallowed by the fog, but their presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers had faded, but the absence of sound was worse. It felt like the quiet before a storm. The pendant grew warmer, its faint pulse quickening against my skin, and I felt the pull again, dragging me toward the trees. I tightened my grip on the chain, my breaths coming faster as I tried to push the sensation away. But it was stronger now, more insistent, and I knew deep down that this thing wasn't going to let us leave, not without something in return. "We can't stay here," I said finally, my voice shaking but firm. "We have to keep moving." Rachel looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What's the point?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter where we go. We're stuck." I crouched beside her, forcing myself to meet her eyes, even as the forest seemed to press closer. "We'll find a way out," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "But we have to keep going. Staying here isn't an option." Eric stepped forward, his flashlight cutting across the road. "Hollywood, there's something we're missing," he said, his voice slow but steady. "The symbols, the lights. This place isn't random. It's trying to tell us something." I didn't respond. The weight of the pendant grew heavier, and the pull in my chest twisted, dragging my gaze toward the forest. The trees seemed darker now, their jagged branches reaching like claws, and the faint glow of the symbols carved into their bark pulsed in time with the hum. "Do you hear that?" Maddie asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze, straining to listen. I froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the faint crackle of the fog and the distant hum. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching on gravel. It was slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. My flashlight wavered as I turned toward the sound, the beam trembling as it cut through the mist. A figure emerged from the fog. It was tall and thin, its form flickering like a broken projection. Its limbs were impossibly long, bent at unnatural angles, and its head tilted to one side, as though it was studying us. The shadows around it rippled, coiling at its feet, and its hollow eyes burned with a faint, sickly light. Rachel screamed, scrambling backward as the figure took a step closer. The pendant flared hot against my chest, its symbols glowing brighter, and the pull became unbearable, dragging me forward even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The whispers returned, sharp and urgent, threading through the air like a swarm of insects. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and inhuman, and I could feel its gaze fixed on me, piercing and unrelenting. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and the pendant's light flared, casting jagged shadows across the road. Eric grabbed my arm, his grip firm and desperate. "Claire, what do we do?" The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting further as if it were waiting for something. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and fragmented, and I realized with a sickening clarity that it wasn't going to leave, not without an offering. "There's an altar," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I didn't know how I knew, but the thought was there, clear and undeniable. In the forest, it's connected to the symbols, to the lights, if we can find it. My voice trailed off as the figure moved again, its hollow eyes narrowing. The pendant burned hotter, its heat searing, and the pull became unbearable. I staggered forward, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. Rachel grabbed me, her hands shaking. "We're not splitting up," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "If there's an altar, we find it together." The figure let out a low guttural sound, its voice fractured and layered, and the shadows surged, spilling across the road like ink. The forest seemed to shift, the trees bending and twisting, and a narrow path appeared, leading deeper into the darkness. The symbols on the trees flared brighter, illuminating the way, and the whispers swirled around us, pushing us forward. We didn't have a choice. The path was narrow, the ground uneven and slick with moisture. The whispers grew louder with every step, their voices pressing against my skull, and the shadows moved with us, shifting at the edges of my vision. The pendant pulsed steadily, its warmth guiding me forward, and I could feel the pull growing stronger as we moved deeper into the forest. The path opened into a small clearing, and I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. At the center of the clearing was a stone altar, its surface worn and cracked, covered in the same glowing symbols that marked the trees. The air was colder here, sharper, and the hum vibrated through the ground, resonating in my bones. The whispers fell silent. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering violently, and I knew without a doubt that we had reached the heart of the crossing. The pendant flared one last time, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the altar, and the pull in my chest became unbearable. We weren't alone anymore. And too, the clearing was a nightmare carved out of the forest, its edges twisting in and out of focus, as though the air itself resisted being here. The altar loomed the center, its surface etched with deep, jagged symbols that pulsed faintly with an unnatural light. It seemed to breathe, the glow, expanding and contracting in time with the hum that resonated through the ground. I couldn't look away, even as the pendant around my neck burned hotter, its pulse sensing with the thrumming energy of the clearing. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the clearing. It was taller now, its limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles, and its hollow eyes burned brighter, searing into me with a gaze that was both predatory and expectant. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my chest, suffocating and final. Maddie let out a choked sob, her hand gripping my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, fragments of fear and desperation, threading through the pull in my chest that dragged me closer to the altar. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, and the symbols carved into the stone seemed to shift and writhe, their sharp angles cutting through the fog that clung to the ground. Eric stepped forward, his flashlight beam flickering as it swept across the altar. "This is it," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "This is what it wanted us to find." Rachel shook her head, her face pale and streaked with tears. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "We can't be here. We need to leave." "There's no leaving," Eric snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. He turned to her, his expression hard and desperate. "You've seen the road. You've seen the lights. This is the only way out." The pendant flared against my chest, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing, and I felt a surge of nausea roll through me. The altar wasn't just a piece of stone. It was alive, humming with the same energy that had followed us Since we'd entered this place, the symbols on its surface pulsed brighter, and the figure at the edge of the clearing tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were waiting for us to act. The pendant's pull became unbearable, dragging me forward, and I stumbled, my knees hitting the ground hard as I clutched at the chain. The heat from the metal seared into my skin, and I could feel it resonating with the altar. The two forces locked in a silent, unrelenting conversation. I knew then what it wanted: a price. The realization hit me like a blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, my gaze fixed on the altar that seemed to pulse with a dark, unyielding hunger. The figure shifted at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering violently, and the silence pressed harder against my ears. So loud, it was almost deafening. Eric was the first to approach the altar. He moved slowly, his flashlight dangling uselessly at his side, his gaze fixed on the symbols that glowed brighter with each step he took. The pendant's heat flared, and I knew he felt it too, the pull dragging us all closer to the edge of something we couldn't fully understand. "There's an order to this," Eric said, his voice distant as though he were speaking to himself. "A ritual." The symbols. Before he could finish, the ground beneath us trembled. A deep, resonant vibration that sent ripples through the fog. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, its voice layered and fractured, and the altar's glow intensified, spilling out across the clearing in jagged beams of light. The pendant around my neck burned hotter, and I felt the pull shift, centering on me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. "Claire," Rachel said, her voice sharp with fear. "What's happening?" I shook my head, my hands trembling as I clutched the pendant. The symbols on its surface writhed and twisted, matching the ones carved into the altar, and I could feel the connection between them, a thread of energy that bound us to this place. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and the hum rose to a deafening pitch. "We have to finish it," Eric said, his voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it needs a sacrifice," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My stomach twisted as the truth settled over me, cold and unrelenting. The altar wasn't just a way out. It was a test, and the price for passage was steep. Rachel's face crumpled, and Maddie let out a choked sob, her hands pressed over her mouth. The silence that followed was suffocating, the hum vibrating through my chest as the pendant flared again, its light casting jagged shadows across the clearing. Eric stepped back, his gaze darting between the altar and the figure that now stood at the edge of the light, its hollow eyes burning with a sickly green glow. "It's the only way," he said, his voice breaking. "One of us has to stay." "No," Rachel said, her voice shaking with anger. "There has to be another way. We can't—" "There's no other way," Eric shouted, his voice raw and desperate. He turned to me, his expression pleading. "You feel it, don't you? The pendant, it's connected to this place, to the altar. If we don't finish this, none of us are getting out." The ground trembled again, and the figure took another step forward, its limbs twisting and elongating as the shadows around it coiled like smoke. The whispers returned, sharp and urgent, threading through the hum, and I felt the pull shift again, centering on me with an intensity that made my vision blur. The altar's glow flared, and the pendant's heat became unbearable. The choice was clear, carved into the stone and etched into my skin. The crossing wasn't going to let us leave. Not all of us. Claire, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I stepped forward, the pull dragging me closer to the altar. With each step, the pendant flared one last time, its symbols blazing with a blinding light, and I knew what I had to do. The hum grew louder, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to sink into my bones. Each step toward the altar felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was fighting to hold me back. The pendant around my neck burned like a brand, its pulsing heat sensing with the glow of the symbols carved into the stone. The clearing seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing closer, and the figure at the edge of the trees watched silently, its hollow gaze unyielding. My chest tightened as I reached the altar, the weight of the air pressing against me like a physical force. The jagged symbols etched into the stone twisted and writhed, their lines shifting in and out of focus. My hand trembled as I reached out, the tips of my fingers brushing against the cold, uneven surface. The hum surged, and the light from the symbols flared, momentarily blinding me. Behind me, Rachel's voice broke the suffocating silence. "Claire, don't," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "We can figure this out. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," I said, the words falling from my lips without thought. My voice sounded distant, detached, as though it belonged to someone else. The pendant pulsed violently against my chest, and the pull grew stronger, dragging me closer to the altar's edge. "This is the only way," Maddie sobbed quietly, her hands pressed over her mouth as she shook her head. Eric stood frozen, his flashlight dangling from his hand, his face pale and unreadable. The figure shifted at the edge of the clearing, its limbs elongating and twisting as it stepped closer, the shadows around it writhing like smoke. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and the whispers returned, sharper and more chaotic, threading through the air like jagged glass. The altar demanded a price. I could feel it, deep in my chest, an unrelenting certainty that filled me with equal parts dread and resolve. The crossing wasn't just a place. It was a force, ancient and unyielding, and it wouldn't let us leave until it was satisfied. I turned to face the others, my breath shallow and uneven. "It's me," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "It has to be me." Rachel's eyes widened, and she stumbled forward, her hands reaching for mine. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to do this. We'll figure something out. We'll fight it." "There's nothing to fight," I said, my heart pounding. "This isn't something we can beat. It's bigger than us, bigger than anything we can understand." I glanced at Eric, whose expression had hardened into something I couldn't quite place. "You know I'm right." He didn't respond, but the faint flicker of guilt in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The pendant flared against my chest, its heat searing, and the altar's glow intensified, spilling out across the clearing in jagged beams. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and fragmented, and the figure took another step forward, its hollow gaze locked onto me. Rachel grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Claire, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this." I pulled away, my hands trembling as I turned back to the altar. The symbols on its surface pulsed violently, their sharp lines cutting through the darkness, and the pull in my chest became unbearable. The shadows around the altar coiled tighter, their edges sharp and jagged, and the hum rose to a deafening crescendo. The gear moved closer, its form flickering violently, and the whispers reached a fever pitch, filling the clearing with their chaotic symphony. The pendant burned brighter than ever, and I felt the pull shift, centering on me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. "This is the only way," I whispered. The words meant as much for me as for them. I stepped onto the altar. "Ende, Sifs, higher." The moment my feet touched the stone, the air shifted. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an unbearable silence that pressed against my ears, and the symbols on the altar flared with a blinding light. The pendant around my neck grew impossibly hot, and I cried out, my knees buckling as the heat spread through my chest, threading through my veins like fire. The figure stopped at the edge of the light, its hollow eyes fixed on me as the shadows around it recoiled. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle, and I felt the pull in my chest release, leaving behind an aching emptiness. The pendant's light dimmed, its surface cooling against my skin, and the altar's glow began to fade, the jagged symbols sinking into the stone. The crossing had taken its price. The ground trembled beneath me, and the light from the altar flared one last time, consuming the clearing in a blinding flash. I closed my eyes against the intensity, my breath catching as the heat surged through me, burning away everything I was. For a moment, I felt weightless, untethered, and then the world shifted, pulling me back into its grasp. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The altar was gone, replaced by a smooth expanse of stone, and the forest around me was still. The figure had vanished, its shadow erased from the edges of my vision, and the whispers were silent. The pendant around my neck was cold, its symbols dim and unreadable. I turned to look for the others, but they were gone. They were gone. The clearing stretched out before me, silent and lifeless, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I was alone. The crossing had let them go, but it had kept me. The pendant pulsed faintly against my chest, a slow, steady rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than a warning. The air was heavy with the weight of what had been taken, and as I stared at the empty forest, I understood the truth. The crossing never truly lets anyone go. The silence was suffocating, thicker than the fog that still hung low around the clearing. My breaths came shallow and uneven, the air feeling heavier. With each passing second, the forest seemed to lean closer, the trees stretching their skeletal branches toward me, as if drawn by some unseen force. The altar was gone, its jagged surface now replaced by smooth, unbroken stone. The pendant around my neck had gone cold, its once persistent pulse now a faint whisper against my skin. I was alone. The others had vanished, taken by the crossing or spared. I wasn't sure which. The clearing where we had stood together moments ago was now void of life, save for the shifting shadows at its edges. The hum that had vibrated through my chest was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to echo through the stillness. I took a tentative step forward, my boots crunching against the damp earth. The pendant flickered faintly, a pale light that barely cut through the darkness. The forest around me felt different now, larger, endless, and alive in a way that set my teeth on edge. Each step I took felt like a gamble, as if the ground might fall away beneath me at any moment, plunging me into whatever abyss this place concealed. The whispers returned. Faint and fragmented, they slipped through the air like threads of smoke, weaving around me and tugging at the edges of my mind. They weren't chaotic this time. They were deliberate, purposeful. My name echoed softly, distorted and stretched, as if spoken by a voice not entirely human. Claire. Dot. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam flickered across the trees, catching on faint carvings in the bark, symbols like those that had marked the altar. They pulsed faintly, their jagged lines glowing with a cold, greenish light. The whispers grew louder, threading through the stillness, and I felt the familiar pull in my chest, weaker now, but still insistent. The shadows shifted at the edge of my vision, and I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the clearing. At first I saw nothing, just the fog, thick and unmoving, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. But then it appeared. The figure. It stood just beyond the reach of the light, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It was taller now, its limbs impossibly thin and elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The hollow void where its eyes should have been seemed to glow faintly, a sickly green light that burned into me. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The pendant flared suddenly, its light cutting through the fog, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering violently before settling into the shadows. The whispers surged, overlapping and chaotic, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the forest around me seemed to close in. You stayed. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was inside me, threading through my thoughts like a splinter buried too deep to remove. Vu, you chose this. I didn't choose anything, I said aloud, my voice breaking. The sound felt small and fragile against the oppressive weight of the clearing. You forced me. This place. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and inhuman, and the pendant burned against my chest, its light dimming as the whispers grew louder. The ground beneath me trembled, a deep resonant vibration that sent ripples through the fog, and the air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my skin like tiny blades. "You belong here now." And the words echoed in my mind, cold and final. "You are part of the crossing." "No," I whispered, my hands trembling as I clutched the pendant. "I can't stay here. I won't." The figure tilted its head, the shadows around it shifting and coiling like smoke, and the pendant flared weakly, its symbols flickering in and out of focus. I could feel the pull again, dragging me toward the edge of the clearing, toward the endless dark that stretched beyond the trees. The whispers pressed harder, their voices rising to a fever pitch, and I knew with a sickening certainty that there was no escape, not for me. The clearing began to shift, the trees bending and twisting as the fog thickened, swallowing the faint glow of the pendant. The ground beneath my feet cracked, jagged lines spreading outward like veins, and the figure moved closer, its hollow gaze fixed on me. "You will carry this place with you." The words slammed into me, sharp and unyielding, and the pendant's light flared one last time before going dark. The hum returned, faint and steady, vibrating through the air as the clearing dissolved around me, replaced by an endless expanse of shifting shadows and pulsing light. And then I was falling. The air rushed past me, cold and unrelenting, and the whispers became screams, raw and fractured, threading through my thoughts like shards of glass. The pendant burned hot against my chest, its symbols flaring brightly, and I felt the pull release, leaving me weightless and untethered. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of the road. The fog was gone, replaced by a faint glow from the distant horizon, and the forest around me was still and silent. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps as I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the others. But the road was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions, and the shadows at the edge of the trees seemed to watch me with a quiet, unspoken promise. The pendant was cold against my skin, its surface smooth and blank, the symbols erased. I reached up to touch it, my fingers trembling, and felt the faintest pulse beneath the metal. A reminder of what I had left behind, or perhaps what I had brought with me. The whispers were gone, but the hum remained, vibrating through the air in a steady, unrelenting rhythm. As I took a step forward, the forest seemed to shift, the trees leaning closer, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty, and I realized with a sinking certainty that the crossing wasn't finished with me. It never would be.